New York. So we're going to look at gunshot analysis, enhancing CCTV images, mobile phone data recovery, 3D reconstructions of crime scenes. We'll hear how it all works, and we'll also hear about the latest cutting-edge research into analysing fingerprints and what a fingerprint can reveal. More than you think. We'll explain later. But first, as one of the UK's leading forensic scientists, Mike Silverman helped to identify and convict dozens of criminals over the course of more than 30 years in his career, including murderers, rapists, armed robbers, muggers and burglars. How did he do that? By careful examination of the evidence the perpetrators or their victims left behind at the scene of the crime. He started his career in the days when the aforementioned fingerprints were still kept on card files, and has seen firsthand the advances in technology which have changed the nature of forensic science over recent decades. He's written a book which is called Written in Blood. Mike Silverman, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Richard.
How are you, Mike?
I'm fine, thanks. Yourself?
Yes, excellent, thank you. Now, some things we're going to talk about over the next half hour or so are quite graphic, and I'll just say this to the dear listening community, who I have enormous affection for. You might find some of this upsetting, and we're going to talk about, violent crime, Mike, to some extent, aren't we?
I think we will, yes.
I think we will. In fact, let's illustrate our point by talking about how your book opens, because it opens in a particularly gruesome way. And this is also, I guess, where the book takes its name from. It's called Written in Blood, and the first chapter is about one of the things that you specialise in is reading patterns in blood at a crime scene.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's as much an art as it is a science. It takes quite a while to get used to it. But, yeah, one of my specialities when I was working at the Metropolitan Police Forensic Science Laboratory back in the 80s was blood distribution analysis, as you say. The idea being is that when you go to a crime scene, murder scene, you can look at the splashes, stains, drips of blood, and there's lots of different types of patterns. And the idea is to try and ascertain the sequence of events that have led to that blood staining, and hence what happened during the offence.
And you're open to the murder that you went to? Was it by a triad gangster who'd murdered somebody in Islington? And it's pretty grim stuff, but no less. No, it's absolutely fascinating. But phenomenally grim. You talk about, I think, we need to go into too much detail, but you knew that this guy had been alive after he'd been attacked, I think, with like a machete, because it was the way that the blood had hit the wall. Can you explain that? That an artery had been severed, and it's the way it had pumped out and hit the wall. Yeah,
there are specific things that cause recognisable patterns, and one of those is what they call arterial spurting. So if you cut an artery which is being pumped, at high pressure through the body, blood is being pumped through high pressure through the body, especially if it's a fairly small nick, the blood will squirt out at quite a distance. And of course the pressure behind that blood will change as the heart pumps, diastolic, systolic pumping. So you actually get, it looks a little bit like those tachographs they used to have in lorries. You get a striking of the blood to the wall high up, and then it sort of comes down low, and then it goes high up again as the heart pumps. And that's a sort of fairly characteristic blood pattern from...
Why does it go high, then low, then high again?
Well, because it's the heart pumping. So, obviously the heart doesn't maintain at the same pressure, otherwise you wouldn't have a pulse beat. So it's as the pulse beats, if you like, the blood is squirting higher and lower
okay,
with every squeeze of the heart.
Yeah, okay. And the blood pressure reduces as the blood is escaping, and so you can see, by looking at that wall, you can sort of track the final moments of the man's life, effectively.
Absolutely. You can see where he was, where his head was, or wherever the wound was that was causing the blood spurting. But at the same time, the weapon that was used will have eventually got blood on it, and as you swing that weapon back for another blow, the blood on the weapon flicks off and forms a different type of pattern, a weapon track, as it's called. And you can look at all these, you can tell how many blows were struck, where they were struck, where the suspect was in relation to each other, and obviously where he fell, and stains and smears tell you other bits of the story.
Can you now approach it? You address this very point right at the beginning of the book, but can you approach a scene like that? So the scene you describe at the start is this chap who's been hacked to death in Islington. It's the sort of thing that if most of us witnessed that scene, if I'd been taken there and looked at that blood ever and that man on the ground, I'm not sure I'd get over it. I would imagine I would be haunted by it. And yet, for you, this is just work. How did you learn to treat it in a emotionally neutral way?
Well, it's as you say, Richard, it's work. You know, you go as a professional and the police are there expecting you to do a job and to do it fairly quickly and very accurately. So you have to concentrate on what you're there for, which is the blood staining or whatever reason other scientists go out to the scenes. But for me, with blood staining, it was the blood pattern analysis. And you just have to ignore the thoughts about that poor victim and how he got like that. You just have to put that at the back of your mind. I'm sure there are other professions like doctors and surgeons that still, you know, have to do that. But it helps being professional because you're concentrating on, you know, drawing blood spatters, photographing them, making your analysis, and not sort of dwelling on the body, because the body's not invariably, but is often there because that's part of the blood distribution. You have to work over the body and round it without sort of disturbing it.
So how soon is it, in a major crime, how soon is a forensic scientist on the scene?
Well, again, it depends what it is, but if it's a murder, and it's a whodunit, as we would call it, as opposed to a domestic, one of the first people, they would seal the scene off, and the police would seal the scene off and call a forensic scientist out straight away to do the blood distribution.
You're first there after the police?
Well, the scenes of crime officers, there's a lot of confusion about what people do. SOCOs, CSI, as they're now called after television programmes, are not forensic scientists. They're scenes of crime officers. They will go there and collect evidence. So what will actually happen is the police will get called out, recognise there's been a murder, scenes of crime will go out and secure the area, put a cordon round it, and clear a path to the body. When I say clear a path, I mean they will collect any evidence, cover any footprints, you know, shoe marks, that is, to make sure that I could go in and make sure I don't disturb the scene. And then someone like me would go in, if there's blood distribution to be looked at, almost next. What happens with SOCO, scenes of crime officer, CSI, whatever you want to call them, would also photograph some of the scene, maybe video it, just to make sure nothing's disturbed by anyone coming after them.
Would you do that on your own? Is it just a job? Is it just one forensic scientist? How does it work?
Well, for the blood distribution, yeah, there would be one forensic scientist who would be the lead. Sometimes I would take an assistant who would, you know, help with the drawings or take notes while I'm dictating them, take some photographs maybe. But generally, I mean, it would only be the one scientist writing the statement and making the conclusions and going to court. So, yeah, usually just the one, maybe with an assistant if it was quite a big scene, or to help train up another forensic scientist.
What else are you doing apart from looking at patterns in blood?
Well, I was a biologist by trade, so when I went to crime scenes, it was usually looking for blood, but I've also looked for other body fluids at crime scenes. Back in the laboratory, a lot of my work was involved in investigating sexual assaults, rapes, as well as murders, any crime against a person.
Just so I really understand how it works, are you working for the state? And does every police force in every area have to have a forensic scientist on call 24 hours a day? Presumably they do.
It used to be some years ago a bit like that because there was a state forensic science laboratory. I worked for the Metropolitan Police Forensic Science Laboratory, but that was amalgamated in 1995 with the Forensic Science Service, and that was the state, effectively, Forensic Science Service. But the government shut that in 2012. So now all forensic science is only provided by commercial industry, and it depends on what the police force can afford and who they've got a contract with as to who comes out.
So all forensic science is commercial now?
It is now, and it's the only country in the world, Richard. It's quite staggering.
Are you getting the sense that you're against that move, and you were then and you are now?
Yeah, I say it was madness, and it was.
Why?
Well,
let's look at it from the other point of view. Why did the government do that? What was that? Obviously, they had logic behind it. There must have been a reason.
Well, you tell me what that was.
It could have been something to do with cost, I guess.
Yeah, that's all it was to do with. But it was, the Forensic Science Service was allegedly losing £2 million a month, which, if you compare that with the cost of other aspects of the criminal justice system that aren't costed like that, it's absolute tiny amount.
Also, I don't understand that concept. When it was the Forensic Science Service, which is owned by the government, I don't quite understand it losing £2 million. It's not a business. It's not like there's no profit and loss, is there?
Well,
it's just a cost, right?
But it was run as a business. What the government was trying to do was to make it a business and then sell it off. It was part of the, government trying to get in some money from its agencies. So it used to be a part of the Home Office, then it was an executive agency, and then it was eventually moved to what they call a GovCo, a government company. So it was wholly owned by the government, but it was running as a company, so it had books, it could borrow money, but only from the government.
Yeah.
But it was they were trying to run a part of the criminal justice system as a profit-making business.
Mike, we're going to come back to you. Mike Silverman, stay there. Wire in the blood. Mike really is one of the UK's top forensic scientists who worked on some of the biggest cases of the last 20 years. But Yvette Silverman, he is one of Britain's top forensic scientists. We have a forensic science theme to much of today's programme. Mike, 30 years you've been in this job, right?
I have indeed, yeah.
30 years.
I know.
See, were you explaining earlier the forensic science is now being privatised? Just my fundamental point was: is there always a forensic scientist on call for all, even if they're working privately, for all police forces?
Yeah, I mean, it's up to the police force to have a contract that makes a forensic scientist available to them.
You have to have, don't you? Because a murder can happen anywhere at any time, and you're going to need a forensic scientist there on... A forensic scientist will always attend the scene of a murder, is that right?
No.
No? OK, go on.
Because, I mean, a lot of murders are domestic. In fact, most murders are domestic. It's not a case of seeking who's done it. It's quite often quite obvious who's done it. It depends on the evidence that's required. If it's a whodunit murder and there is blood distribution, then they'll almost certainly call someone out.
But that's generally the only criteria. When it's a whodunit and there's blood distribution, that's the only time a forensic scientist goes to a murder scene.
Well, again, Richard, in the old days, if I dare say that, when it wasn't money changing hands, forensic scientists used to go to a lot more scenes. Now it actually costs the police. They think twice before calling them out.
And that's a great span, isn't it? I mean, there's something else you address in the book, but that 30-year span and the developments in science, in forensic science, in blood analysis, in DNA in that time have been revolutionary, haven't they?
I mean, I think you put the finger on it, literally. I mean, when I started, fingerprints had been going since 1900, and nothing much had changed. I mean, some forensic science had been developed and it was getting better. But when DNA profiling came along, it completely revolutionised it. It turned what was effectively a corroborative science, i.e. the police had to find someone and then the scientist would compare samples from the suspect and the victim and the crime scene and things like that, to an investigative tool where you could actually get a minute amount of blood or saliva or other body fluid at a crime scene and then give the police the name of the person that's come from.
Amazing. So what you're doing there is that's DNA analysis, isn't it?
Yeah.
And just so we understand it, the DNA sequence, an individual's DNA sequence is in every single cell.
All except the red blood cells, yeah.
All except the red blood cells. That's interesting.
Because it's the white blood cells that in the blood that have the DNA in them.
But also, but you can get DNA presumably from skin, from hair. You can get it from other places.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, almost everything else.
And it's in. I also know this because I talk about biology a lot. But the DNA is in the genes. Is that right? Is it the genes? Is it the DNA that makes up the gene?
It is. That's the molecule that actually sort of determines the blueprint of life, if you like.
Given that revolution that's happened in your time, have you had any cases that you've gone back to using new technology and that have been overturned or resulted in a different outcome?
I haven't personally, because by the time DNA had got to the latest technology, I'd moved on to other jobs within forensic science. I was sort of dealing with international work and wasn't doing bench casework anymore. So my cases have been okay, I think. But there are cold case reviews are carried out a lot.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard of one of mine, but they do happen.
They do happen, yeah. So when you started 30 years ago, it was like 1900, but they were just using fingerprints.
It wasn't 1900 when I started.
No, it was like 1900, you said earlier.
Yeah, I mean, fingerprints were introduced by the Metropolitan Police in 1900, and other than the fact it was computerised, the technique is basically the same. Obviously, techniques in doing computer comparisons has improved hugely. I mean, there were no computers when I started, so the guests you'll talk to later, who are talking about computer analysis, there was no computers to analyse. It's only since then that computers have been used both by criminals and also by the police in order to catch criminals.
It is, even though use of DNA that you can now get from a crime scene, as you do as a forensic scientist, very often leads to a more accurate and certain conviction. It also comes with problems, doesn't it? I mean, if we take the case of Amanda Knox, for example, Meredith Kercher, which is going on and on and on. I think they've been found guilty again, haven't they, in the latest review? But a lot of that hinges around essentially a piece of DNA, doesn't it? I think it's a piece of blood, it's about how Amanda Knox's DNA got onto a particular knife. But I guess the point I'm getting at is, whilst it can be accurate, I suspect it can also, if there is, for whatever reason, some kind of cross-contamination, it can probably also, in its own way, lead to some miscarriages, can't it?
You're absolutely right. One of the things with DNA is, over the last few years, one has been able to get DNA results, full DNA profiles from smaller and smaller amounts, till you get down almost to molecular size. If you can see it, you can profile it. The problem then becomes is, what's the significance of what you found? On the basis that, anybody can leave fragments of skin, DNA anywhere. When I leave this studio, there will be my DNA here, which will be here for some years.
Wow, is that right?
Yeah, and your studio, everyone. So the guests, if I wanted to do a DNA sweep of this studio, we could probably name all of the people who are in here, if they're on the database, over the last few months.
That's fantastic. That's a really good fact.
But of course the point is, what's the significance of that? So the fact you find blood from a particular person, and it was an absolutely microscopic amount, what does that mean? And it's that now becomes rather important.
Yeah.
It's the interpretation in the context of the case. And unfortunately, that, for me, that's one of the things that gets lost in the commercialisation of forensic science.
Is there a way, if you take the Amanda Knox, for example, is there a way that some of her DNA could have got onto the knife accidentally or by mistake or by cross-contamination?
I'd have to look at great detail at the case and see exactly where the knife's from, and all those sort of things have to be done as part of putting the DNA result in context.
But I guess the point I'm getting at is, because everyone's of the mind now that DNA analysis is so exact, and it's, 1 billion to 1 chance it's somebody else's when they find your DNA. The problem is, if at a murder scene, let's separate the Amanda Knox and Meredith Kercher, but just at a murder scene, if for some reason there's some kind of cross-contamination, a policeman drops a knife and a microscopic bit of DNA ends up on that knife, then you might end up with people in a court saying, well, it's definitely that person because it's 1 billion to 1 chance that DNA is somebody else's DNA. Yeah. And in reality, cross-contamination is probably quite simple, isn't it?
Well, it does happen. I've had cases where it does happen, especially in the early days of DNA, where we weren't really aware of just how sensitive the techniques were. I had a case where DNA was found under some fingernails that were submitted to the laboratory, and they matched on the DNA database, they matched somebody else, which was all very well and good, except the person they matched had died 3 weeks earlier and was a murder victim themselves.
What was the story there then?
Well, it was. It turned out in the end that what had and it was a lot of investigation on my part to sort of to find out how it happened. But what had happened is contamination had occurred at the mortuary, and when you do a forensic post-mortem, which is only done on suspected murder victims, they're the only people in a mortuary where their fingernails are removed. So there are pairs of scissors that the pathologist at the post-mortem examination uses to remove the victim's fingernails. And these scissors had got contaminated from 3 weeks or a month previously, because the technique they used for washing them wasn't good enough to actually destroy the DNA.
That's a very good example of what we're talking about. Because that common statement, I have not been able to go into the details really wanted to. You worked on the Rachel Nickel case, Damilola Taylor, all sorts of fascinating cases. If you're interested in Mike's work, you can read about it in his book. His book is Written in Blood, and it's out now, the remarkable casebook of one of Britain's top forensic scientists, Written in Blood. Mike Silverman, sorry it's shorter than we planned, but thank you very much.
No, thank you, Richard.
Mike Silverman there, and we have more on forensic science and more on the science of crime fighting a bit later. Let's return to our forensic science special today here on 5 Live. And we've spoken to arguably the country's leading top forensic scientist earlier today. Let's now look at another area of forensic crime fighting, analysing fingerprints. It's nothing new. They may have been using fingerprints since 1900, as we heard earlier. But now they can be used to identify so much more, including what a criminal has eaten, whether they've taken drugs, and what medication they may be using. A team of scientists at Sheffield Hallam University have been working with West Yorkshire Police on developing the technology. Dr. Simona Francesi is leading the research, and Neil Dennison is Regional Head of Identification Services at West Yorkshire Police. Good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Francesi, tell me, in your research here, what can we find from fingerprints that we couldn't find before?
Well, all sorts of things, really. It's like a new world is being disclosed before our eyes. The trick is that, people have not thought about this for 100 years, is that what is left in a finger mark on a surface essentially are a mixture of chemicals, and they come from either your body or from the contact with other substances, for example from handling drugs, and so in principle whatever people have touched or whatever people have ingested and then excreted through sweat, because essentially that's what a finger mark is, then we can detect. So you can imagine there's plenty of information there to profile the offender and his activities prior to committing the crime.
Why is that new? I'm sure we could have all worked that out quite a long time ago, that a bit of sweat from a finger could tell you whether or not someone had taken some drugs. Why is this new?
I think the focus was on primarily identifying the suspects through the characteristic ridge pattern, and forensic science has always been in the past a science that wasn't really concerned with explaining what's happening when applying a certain technique, so all the chemical physical mechanism behind it. But there is now a big interest into the chemistry of the finger marks, so more and more people are now investigating these aspects.
Neil, tell me, as Regional Head of Identification Services at West Yorkshire Police, what is Identification Services broadly, by the way, Neil? What does that include?
Well, I'm responsible for the delivery of services in respect of fingerprints, footwear. In the facility in West Yorkshire Police, we also manage DNA. We have imaging services. And we develop fingerprints in the laboratories.
Right. And what have you seen? Tell me about the advancements you've seen in the use of fingerprints in the last few years.
Pretty much nothing. It's as Simona said, and I think Professor Silverman said earlier, for over 100 years, all we've done with fingerprints is pretty much put some powder on whatever surface the individual might have touched, develop that into an image, and then try to identify that image. In terms of the use of the fingerprint itself, it hasn't changed much at all. In terms of how we identify that fingerprint and the tools that we've got available, it's developed massively. In the last 10 years, or 10 to 15 years, computerization has enabled us to go from searching manual fingerprints, where we might search the fingerprints from a certain area against a mark from a crime scene. We can now search many, many millions of fingerprints in a matter of minutes. Yeah. And there's now a national fingerprint service system, so we are able to search a fingerprint from anywhere against everybody in the country who might have had the fingerprints taken.
Is anyone who's ever had their fingerprints taken kept on computer now?
If they are actually convicted of a recordable offence, okay. Yes.
What about if they're given a caution?
It depends on the circumstances around that caution. We have retention periods. We've got strict rules around how long we can and can't keep fingerprints for.
If you've been convicted, how long can you keep them for?
If you're convicted, we can keep them until you 99 years is the current guideline.
Oh, right, okay. That's forever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so anyone convicted, tough. You're allowed to hold that on a national database, and you can feed an image in, and within seconds it can just scan all the other fingerprints, can it, that it's got on there?
In a nutshell, yes. It's not quite like you see on CSI on TV, I've got to say. It does involve a specialist who has to actually interpret that fingerprint. They actually need to tell the computer which finger they think it is in many occasions to narrow down the potential respondents. But yes, once the individual expert has actually coded that fingerprint, the computer can give them a list of potential respondents in a matter of minutes, but then a human being has to then interpret the result. Having said that, when you ask about developments, at the moment there are now what we call lights out technologies available which are being tested where the computer actually tells you that it is a match and isn't a match, but it still relies on a human being to actually interpret that.
Why do we still need focus so much on fingerprints, given that everything is just as individual, isn't it? And any cell, any bit of DNA which can come through sweat or hair or the shedding of a bit of skin, that's no less individual than a fingerprint. Mike Silverman, who was on earlier, top forensic scientist, was saying, just by sitting in our studio, he'll have left behind some DNA that will be there for months, if not years. He said he could go into a radio studio and he could find the DNA of every single person who's been a guest on this show going back for months. At a crime scene, why still focus so much on fingerprints?
I think you touched on it earlier. Again, I was listening on my way over here, and the comment that was made was about the transferability of DNA, and that is the problem with it. Yes, it's a massive improvement in terms of detecting crime, but the bottom line is you've got to prove with DNA whether or not that DNA was present at the scene or it had been transferred into it, whereas a fingerprint can only be left by the donor, or it takes very special skills to be able to plant a fingerprint. And the other thing, just
go on.
I'll sell fingerprints while I'm on. DNA tends to be the buzzword in terms of forensic science, but actually we still get about 3/5 fingerprint detections as opposed to 2/5 DNA. So fingerprints is still the foremost identification technique in policing.
But if what Mike says is true, and I'm sure it is because he's one of the country's leading forensic scientists, because he's sat in our radio studio, his DNA has been left behind and will be there for months, and will have been, I guess, deposited. I mean, you'll know this, Dr. Francesi, him sitting in a chair in a studio, what DNA is he leaving behind? Where's that coming from?
I'm not the best person to answer that question. I'm dealing with fingerprints, but really, it comes from any bits of your body. So you mentioned that earlier. So even if you touch a surface, there is a certain amount of DNA found in
DNA
finger
is
marks.
in sweat, is it?
Well, it is. It's really everywhere, and although very, very difficult to find DNA in finger marks, there is the possibility to also detect that. So you got to be careful. But as Neil said before, it's all about sensitivity. So sometimes the quantities of DNA are really, really very minute.
But Neil, if I've broken into a house, but I've used gloves. If what Mike says is true, then I will automatically have left some DNA there, right? If I've been on a crime scene, even wearing gloves, I'll have left behind some DNA. In the absence of a fingerprint, you always then search for DNA.
We search for DNA on likely surfaces where you could potentially have left the quantity of DNA we require to actually get a profile in order to match it. The reality is that we have done trials because, as you quite rightly say, people think, well, if you leave DNA, why bother with fingerprints, just get the DNA. And we have done trials in the past where we've actually spent an awful lot of money swabbing for DNA in the hope that we might, I suppose it's a bit like fishing, you're just hoping you get a bite. So you swab for DNA, you send off the sample to see if you've got a profile and see if it can be matched. And the results we get have been very, very poor. We've spent an awful lot of money, say £250,000 to get 5 detections, something like that. So, it's proved at this stage that the technology isn't there to actually use DNA exclusively.
Well, so thank you to you both. So, Dr. Francesi, in terms of using fingerprints to find out if a person has taken some drugs, for example, that is, tell me how you do that again. Is that by sampling the sweat that comes off a fingerprint?
We don't destroy the fingerprint, so that's quite important to say. So that can be also used afterwards as evidence. So we don't actually swap the mark, but we use a mass spectrometry technique that is able to sample at 100 micrometer resolution. And so we sample from each 100 micrometers the chemicals that are in there. And so we do this by measuring the weight of the molecules that we found, and the weight of the molecules are quite distinctive. They can tell us about the identity of that particular molecule. So it's a bit, if you can imagine the scenario of every single person on this planet having the same weight that never changes through life, that becomes a characteristic of the person, so that person can be identified through their weight. That's what happens really with molecules.
Yes, but it's either because they're fingers of such drugs, or you can find evidence of drugs in the sweat that's secreted through a finger onto a fingerprint. They're the two ways, right?
There is a difference because when you find a metabolite of the drug, then you know that the person has actually consumed the drug in different ways. So that the forensic scenario changes.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Simona Francesi leading the research into the latest on fingerprinting, and Neil Dennison as well. Thank you to you, Regional Head of Identification Services at West Yorkshire Police. We're expecting to hear from Michael Gove in the House of Commons in around 10 minutes from now. He'll be speaking about the developments in the row about alleged extremism. Now, just to flag up, we'll be opening up the what we call the live space. It's sort of a separate little studio between our two main on-air studios. We have guests sitting in there now at a table waiting to broadcast. So the live space here in Salford opens up after 3:30, and we'll be exploring the latest developments in forensic science. It's a forensic science special today. And this is as forensic science applies to crime fighting. In particular, we'll look at digital forensics, what it is, how it works, what are its limitations, and how can it help bring a criminal to justice. I'll hear about 3D crime scene reconstruction, how you enhance grainy CCTV image as well to get the precise detail that you need, and how mobile phone analysis is now at the cutting edge of fighting crime. Before all of that, let's hear about the world of ballistics. How do you detail the precision location of a gunshot, or work out what type of gun was used from the evidence left at the scene? We sent our reporter Rowan Bridge to meet Adam McCarthy from Equitas Forensics, to see how real silent witness works. And they began by putting on their protective clothing.
So in a real lab, we would be looking to basically cover any exposed skin. So we're looking to wear a laboratory coat, also a mouth guard, and laboratory grade DNA-free gloves as well. So what's also required is to seal up those gaps, if you like, between the juncture of the gloves and your laboratory coat. So we're looking to give myself a wrap in this tape. So I'll put it around the juncture there of the glove and the actual laboratory coat itself. We've got a sealed exhibit box. So this is basically as it's come out of the crime scene, prepared by crime scene investigators. So in this box we have an air pistol. It's a black metallic gun-shaped object. The very first thing I'd have to do is actually put on a new pair of gloves, again for those anti-contamination considerations, and then charge on with our actual examination, which includes descriptive notes, perhaps some early measurements, and also photographs as well.
So what sorts of things might you want to photograph then?
One of the beauties of this work is that you don't really know what you're going to be faced with until you open the box. So there may be powders, there may be pieces of broken glass. The obvious one where, for example, a firearm has been discharged close range, there may be a blood patterning effect called backspatter, where you're having to document what are really quite fine or small blood spots. So with this particular weapon, where we would start looking for modifications is one of the most important aspects is the barrel. If there are more and more machine marks or tool marks, gives you an idea of the crudeness or sophistication of the operation. So we're looking to see if any blockages have been removed, and again to what quality that's been done. Another phase of the examination involves getting it under the microscope, so it provides us obviously magnification to be looking at those various evidence types which aren't clear to the naked eye. So they might present themselves in terms of fibres. You're looking at individual fibres. There might be small hairs available, and again we mentioned blood staining, some of that staining that's just so small that you wouldn't be able to see it under the naked eye.
How crucial can something that small, a single fibre, a tiny speck of blood, how crucial can that be to a case?
Absolutely. It's more than the information that you can glean from those particular either specks of blood, which might provide enough material to give you a DNA profile, which makes an association down the line. And again, with the likes of fibres, say this particular item was wrapped up in a specific piece of clothing, and that can be linked to other properties or crime scenes within the case.
Sometimes you may have to fire one of these weapons. Just to explain why that's important and how that might happen.
So you might have a bullet, or in our example, a air weapon pellet, which has been recovered from a victim. And you will need to go ahead and do microscopic comparisons between the recovered pellet and ones that you generate in the laboratory. So the trick there is to fire the weapon, recover those pellets that you've fired, and then you've got something to compare against with your victim's pellet. I'm just removing the pin from the back of the chamber, and what we need to do is grab out a pellet. Just loading that into the back of the air pistol. Now we're ready, it's live and good to be fired. Okay, firing.
It's clearly a meticulous process of examining the gun, a microscopic examination of any bullets or residue and what have you. Once you've gone through all your testing process, explain what happens then.
You're presented with a raft of notes, analytical results. You need to then provide a report for the purposes of either the investigating officers in the first part, where they might decide to carry on and take out or focus on particular aspects of the evidence, or further down the line providing a witness statement for purposes of court.
Now, let's the man you heard in there, Adam, is with me. We're in what's called our prestigious live space now, here at the Salford facility, owned by the BBC. And let me say that to some other guests. So Adam is here, who you heard there, talking about forensics. And we have other guests who are going to talk about crime fighting. It's a sort of science, forensics, crime fighting special, all after 3:30. Ken Bagshaw is here, founder of 3DSI, who specialise in digital reconstruction of crime scenes. Yes, Ken.
That's
good
correct,
afternoon.
Richard. Good afternoon to you.
Jane Leponis is here, from Taylor Smith Forensics, specialising in forensic photography, audio enhancement and CCTV analysis.
Hello.
CCTV is terrible, isn't it, basically?
Yes.
It's just rubbish.
Absolutely.
Every time you look at it, the times I've come close to sort of crime scenes, both times as a victim, I might add, but by the time either the CCTV camera wasn't working, which is more common than not, it seems to me. They go, oh yeah, it was switched off, or the footage they get is so rubbish you can't tell who's who anyway. Do you specialise in enhancing the actual quality that you've got?
Well, as best as we can, yes.
Yeah,
as well as exporting it from DVR players, etc.
Okay, great. That's good stuff. And then Glenn Siddle is here, who is head of Equitas, which is Adam's company, from the tape you heard with Rowan Bridge there. So Equitas Forensics, and Glenn specialises in recovering data from mobile phones and PCs. And we were talking off air. He'll explain this after 3:30, but I gave him an old phone of mine, and Glenn has worked out where I live. You've got my bank details. You've worked out the code I put on my phone to get into my phone. You can crack it all from picking up someone's phone, can't you?
Pretty much.
You can find out where they live, what their bank details are, what their secret codes are, all sorts of... What else have you got on there? My mates' addresses. You know a lot about me.
Yeah, your friends. They must love you.
By the way, this is you guys are the two Equitas and Taylor Smith Forensics, your private forensics companies. My guest in the first hour was talking. He's been a forensic scientist for 30 years, and for much of his career, it was all owned by the government.
Yeah.
And I've got to go. We're going to Michael Gove now. Sorry, I was going to come on to a very important point, but perhaps one that's a little too technical and tedious. Anyway, we'll get into the more exciting area of analysing evidence after we've heard from Michael Gove, who's making this what he has called important statement to the Commons, which is between the two main radio studios here at the BBC's Salford facility. We have a forensic crime fighting special today. Mike Silverman was on in the first hour. 30 years, man and boy, he's a forensic scientist working with the police. We have three excellent guests with me in our live space. Ken Bagshaw, founder of 3DSI, specialised in digital reconstruction of crime scenes. Jane Laponis is here from the Taylor Smith Forensics. They specialise in making CCTV images better because they are generally rubbish. And Glenn Siddall is here, head of Equitas Forensics. They specialise in recovering electronic data. He's been looking at an old phone of mine, has worked out my bank details, where I live, date of birth probably.
Yep.
Did you get date of birth?
No.
What did you get?
I can get that off Wikipedia. I don't need to go on your...
Yeah, that is true. Although I think Wikipedia says I was born in Bangladesh. You can't entirely rely on it. But a lot. We'll come on to what you found on the phone in just a second. So hello everybody. Hello everyone. Welcome to our live space. We'll start with Ken Bagshaw. Now Ken, you're a former head of the Forensics Crime Scene Survey Unit at Manchester Police. So you worked with the forensic team at Manchester Police. Now you've set up your own company. So you've decided to go and make some money, in other words.
Well, that's the game plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it takes some time to obviously get established.
You've only done this a couple of years, haven't you, right?
Going on for 3 years now,
3 years.
We're based at the Sharp project over in East Manchester.
Just on a wider point, Mike Silverman was saying to me earlier that we are the only Western country that doesn't have a state forensic service, which does seem strange, doesn't it? That I understand why you might get a private company to enhance CCTV images, because often police will bring in technical experts. You might get a private company to look at an old mobile phone because you're a technical expert. You buy in expertise, that's fine. But it's a bit more confusing as to why you would introduce the profit motive into going to a murder scene and looking at how the blood has fallen on the floor.
I don't think it's so much a profit motive. It's just that the services with the cutbacks in especially the police service have obviously opened up the market to private individuals and private companies, and simply because that service.
But that means the company is making money out of investigating a violent sexual assault, doesn't it?
Well, basically somebody has to do it, and what we're doing is
but the police used to do it, or the state used to do it.
But there was always the especially with specialised services, who paid for it? Was it the police or was it the CPS? There was always a grey area between who actually picked up the final bill.
But to come back to what we're talking about here, this is slightly different. This is specialism, isn't it? So it's all really interesting stuff. I promise you, dear listener, have a listen. So, Ken, your company 3DSI, and what you primarily do is you digitally recreate crime scenes. Ken, tell me more.
Basically, I do 3D laser scanning of crime scenes, and what that does, not to get too technical, is to create a three-dimensional point cloud. And what you can do with that point cloud is put the colour content on. So what it gives you is an instantaneous 3D crime scene reconstruction.
Yeah, okay. So you can, on a computer screen, walk around the crime scene. Is that the idea? Show me, Ken. Split that computer around so I can see it. I imagine you can see us as well if you go to bbc.co.uk/5live, sitting in the prestigious live space here. Okay, so what you've done here, that's a bedroom, is it? What are we looking at?
This is the studio.
It's a studio.
That's
this studio.
That we're actually sat in, yeah. So
fine,
just bear with me
sorry.
a second.
Oh yes, there are the familiar garish colours of the BBC Salford facility.
Now we've
Gosh, that's amazing. God, that's clever. So what you've done there is you've created a 3D image. It's a bit like looking at a floor plan for a property, but it's 3D, and you've included the outer walls, the logo is on there, the glass doors, the carpet. How have you captured that in such detail?
That's the 3D laser scanning process.
So this camera, you just walk around here with a camera, do you?
It's actually a camera, it's a 3D laser.
Okay.
And what that does is actually scan the room. So what you can actually see is what you actually get a return from, which gives you the 3D point cloud.
It's fantastic. It's amazingly detailed. So a laser can read things like logos.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if we actually zoom in, we can get some real content and real detail.
How long does it take you to scan that?
Each scan is about 10 minutes, between 6 and 10 minutes, and then
so that takes 10 minutes. What I'm looking at there, which is a perfect 3D recreation of this very room, it takes 10 minutes for scanning.
That's 4 scans, so that's about between half an hour and 40 minutes. Yeah,
it's that can be done that quickly is remarkable. I would imagine I would have assumed that that's days of work. How often do the police call you in to create a 3D image of a crime scene?
I actually specialise now in taking this out to the police services overseas, so I actually teach this. But as far as police services are concerned, some of them have their own 3D laser scanning services, and some of them, believe it or not, don't actually go down this process. So this is cutting-edge technology, which only a few police services have the ability to...
But you can provide this service. It doesn't just have to be for crime scenes, does it?
No, this is for everything. I mean, this is used in engineering, it's used in architecture, it's used in heritage. So
you can do that in 40 minutes?
Yeah.
That's a fantastic thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, yeah. I mean, this is technology. We're right at the cutting edge of technology. So,
yeah.
And this particular scanner used to be limited to 120 metres as far as the range is concerned. Now the one that I've actually got can go up to 330 metres.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Let's talk to the other two guests as well whilst you're here. We have, as I said, Glenn Siddall is here. Glenn Siddall, digital forensics expert, founder of Equitas Forensics. Hello, Glenn.
Hello.
So I gave you an old phone of mine. It is quite old. I think I've not used it for a couple of years.
Yeah, there's a lot of 09 stuff on there.
09, what's that mean? Oh, the year 2009. Yeah, that's maybe the last time I used it.
Yeah.
So you went in there, you worked out what my passcode was.
Yep.
How'd you do that?
I'm not going to tell you.
Why
that.
not?
Because everybody will be at it, won't they? If I say. I'll tell you later. I'll tell you when we go off there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's exciting. Listeners, I'll share it with you in the podcast. But this is interesting in terms of what you can learn from a phone, because most of us at some point or another will have left a phone lying around. So talk me through. You've prepared a file here on what you got from my old phone that I gave you, an iPhone 4 from 2009-10. What did you get out of it, Glenn?
Well, we got everything out of it, basically. If I just fire that up there. We got all your old contacts, your Bluetooth devices that you were connected to, iMessage contacts, you name it. If it was on the phone, we've recovered it.
Right. Give me some specific examples of things that you got.
Well, photographs mainly.
Because the truth is, actually, I'm not nervous about this because the stuff I keep on my phone is generally quite boring. I imagine some people would get quite tense at this point as to what might be uncovered. There's nothing that interesting on my phone.
To a criminal.
To
maybe.
a criminal? Okay, go on. What you got?
Well, the fact that you took a photograph of your bank card was quite useful.
That is hilarious. I did. That was true, as my wife needed to pay for something somewhere, and she needed...
You texted it to her,
so I
didn't you?
texted both sides of my bank card. Is that a schoolboy error, Glenn? Should you not be texting photos of your bank card to people?
Leave that in your wallet.
What about if I deleted it? I thought I had deleted it.
Well, the deletion process doesn't always get rid of it either. People, again, like me, can recover that, so...
You can recover a photo that I've deleted on my phone?
Yes.
How?
Again... Everybody be at it if I told you now.
Can you recover all photos or just some photos? How can you ensure, here's a good question, that a photo that you've deleted is deleted properly, deleted for good?
You can't.
Okay, so why are some photos unrecoverable then?
Ordinarily because once they've been deleted, a more recent photograph has been taken and it's overwritten the old photograph. So as a result it's no longer resident on the handset.
Okay, but you can't really control that?
No.
Anything else you got of interest? Show me the file.
Oh well, yeah. I mean, I know where you live now, which is pretty good. Within the photographs that you took, the GPS coordinates of the photographs were embedded within it.
Yeah.
So as a result, I was able to look for the geographical location where you took those photos, and we can see your house.
You can see my house. You can see that photo, that Ferrari. That's at Chris Evans's house.
Yeah, luckily you had location services turned off there, so I don't know where that Ferrari
is.
There's
a lot of photos of my house. Your address is slightly wrong. You've got my road correct, but you've got the number of the house wrong. However, you've got loads of photos of my house, so you put together the my street with the photo of the house, and bingo.
And we've got your bank card, so it's,
and you've got my bank card as well.
Yeah.
Okay, listen, just some sad news to bring you that has just been reported, which is that the comedian and the actor Rick Mayall has died. So Rick Mayall has died. A spokesman for his management has just announced this, that Rick Mayall has died. I think arguably one of the all-time great comedy actors, really. Rick Mayall, a fantastic performer. We'll hear tributes to Rick Mayall on Drive a little bit later. Jane.
Hello.
You are Jane Laponis, and along with your business partner Wendy Lomas Williams, you run Taylor Smith Forensics. Tell us, and you're a former TV camera operator, is that right?
Yes.
But one of the things that you do, that your branch of private forensic work does, is you enhance CCTV images. And you've got some examples here in front of you. People can look at us by going to bbc.co.uk/5live. Jane, tell me about your work.
Well, as you can see by these examples, that's attempts to enhance, like the van, the registration plate. And because of the quality of the footage isn't like you would film in television, which is 25 frames per second, this one in particular was 12 frames per second, so there's lots of data and signal information missing. So because we can't enhance, even using a waveform monitor, for example, trying to get the brightness levels and lighten things up like with the wheels, all we could do really was follow from multiple locations the van that was of interest to the police and pinpoint artifacts in that image to try and create a storyline. We use the same edit suites that you would in television, Avid and Final Cut Pro.
Right.
And use various filters, specialised equipment and hardware to bring out what we can and denoise, various forensic practices using filters, as mentioned before, just to try and paint a picture of what that van is and where it's going.
Okay, so what you've done there is you've enhanced, I think, a sign in the window, and you've worked out what that sign says. So you're zooming in and picking up detail by enhancing the imagery.
Well, for example, that was a van that was seized.
Okay.
So a photographer's gone along to the garage where the van was seized, taken photographs. We've built up a picture from multiple locations following this van, and we've matched the van. For example, in this example here, I've brought out the wheels. Looking at the wheels, that's actually the best enhancement that could be
you've
done.
really enhanced the wheel.
Yeah,
And the gap between the picture quality, I mean, is that from a photo and you've just matched the photo with what looks...
Yes, this is a van that was seized.
That. What's new in this? What's the new science in the way that you can enhance CCTV?
I think the fact it's fantastic that CCTV is getting better and better with high definition.
It's still a bit rubbish. I mean, even
it is rubbish, yeah.
It is though, isn't it?
Yeah.
These stills here of this van you keep talking about.
That took me about
yellow
10 days
The van
to
is
do.
yellow in that picture. It's clearly wasn't yellow in reality. It's grainy, there's a blue splodge patch across the middle of the picture. You cannot read the reg plate. That in this day and age, you think how good the cameras are on Samsung phones or on the latest Apple, right, the latest iPhones. They're now almost as good a quality as quite an expensive professional camera that you might buy as a specialist. And yet, CCTV cameras that are much bigger than the thing embedded in a Samsung phone are giving us that rubbish.
But of course, you've got dirty cameras to put up with.
Yeah.
That's the light from the street lights making that look that colour. It's actually a white van. So we have
I guess
to go,
as well, it's all very well saying there's some brand new cameras out there. The cost in replacing all of Britain's CCTV with the latest cameras is phenomenal. Yeah. Presumably in maybe 20 years they might have caught up with where tiny little cameras are now in flat telephones, but it's going to take a long, long time. Meaning that you'll be kept in work for many years to come. That's the good news. Guys, thank you for that insight. And this will also all be included on our podcast as well a bit later. But thank you. It just obviously was a bit of a surface level introduction to your work, but it was hugely impressive. Thank you very much indeed. What are you going to do with my bank details now?
We'll find out how much you've got in your bank account. We'll make that decision.
Thankfully, that is a bank account that I no longer use. However, if I'm defrauded over the next few months, and unfortunately, Glenn, yours will be the first name that I give to the police.
It's a good job I can hide my tracks, isn't it? It's the perk of the job.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, that would technically make you an excellent criminal if you wanted to be one.
And the fact I'm from North Manchester. Well,
thank you very much. So Glenn Siddle of Equitas, Jane Laponis from Taylor Smith Forensics, Ken Bagshaw from 3DSI, and their friends Sean and Adam who've come see us as well. That's it. Thank you very much indeed. We'll be back tomorrow with some more guests and TV reviews. Coming up with those, some tributes to Rick Mail, who it's just been announced has passed away.